Okay. So good evening, everyone. We're gonna talk about the Book of Chronicles tonight, 1 and 2, and we have here the tagline: "Look back to look forward." Okay. So later we will figure out why this is like the main tagline of this book. So I'll pass on the mic to Ate Clenke.
Okay, guys. All right. First of all, thank you very much for coming to our session tonight. Of course, no, nandito sa books of First and Second Chronicles, and um, I will be sharing some part of our survey, and then Mel will share the rest later. And of course, we will also have games, so be excited. All right, so bisan close ang inyong mga cameras, um, I hope you listen. Okay, so first, let us go sa ato ang overview and background sa Book of First and Chronicles. And so that no, naatay ka ng makuha na to, mag-grasp na to kung unsa jud as a whole ang First and Second Chronicles. Let us watch this.
The books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. While they're two separate books in our Bibles, that division is not original. Due to scroll length, the book was divided in two, but it was written as one book with one coherent storyline. Now, in our English Bibles, Chronicles comes after the books of Samuel and Kings, and most of Chronicles is actually repeat content from those books. And so most modern readers, when they come to Chronicles, they think, wait a minute, I just read all of this, and so they skip it. And that's a shame, because this book is really unique and important in the Bible. In the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book because it summarizes all of the Jewish scriptures. The first word in the book is Adam, the first character at the beginning of the story, and then the last paragraph announces the return of Israel from exile. Now, we don't know who wrote this book, but we can tell from details within it, it was produced by somebody who lived a couple hundred years after the Israelites returned from the Babylonian exile. Now, for this author, Jerusalem and the temple were rebuilt some time ago, and as we learned from Ezra and Nehemiah, things were not going well. The great prophetic hope was that the city and the temple would be rebuilt, that God would come to live among his people, the Messianic king would come, and all the nations would come live under his peaceful rule, and none of that has happened. And so the author of Chronicles has reshaped these stories of David and Solomon and the kings of the past in order to provide a message of hope for the future. And we'll see that he's designed this book to emphasize two clear themes. First, the hope of the coming Messianic king, and second, the hope for a new temple. Let's just dive in and you'll see these themes all over the book. First Chronicles begins with 9 chapters of genealogies, long lists of names. And you'll read these and think that this is kind of boring, and that may be true for you, but actually they're very, very important. The author is summarizing here the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming all of the key characters in the stories. And as he does so, he shapes the genealogies to emphasize 2 key lineages. First is the line of the promised Messianic king. So lots of space is dedicated to tracing the line of Judah that led all the way to King David, to whom the Messianic promise was given. And then from David, the author traces that line up into his own day. The other family line that receives lots of attention here is that of the priesthood, the descendants of Aaron, who, of course, served in the temple. And so right from the start, you can see the 2 main themes: the author's hope of the Messiah coming to build a new temple, and it's rooted in these ancient genealogies. Now, after that, the author moves into the stories about David, and most of these are going to be familiar to you from the book of Samuel, but again, there's some really important differences. So first of all, the author leaves out all of the negative stories about David, where he's portrayed as weak or immoral. So Saul chasing David around the desert and persecuting him, the story of David's adultery with Bathsheba and then murdering her husband, all of that is gone. And what's left are the stories that portray David as a good guy. And not only that, there's also new additional material that you won't find in the book of Samuel that shows David in a very positive light. So there's a large block of chapters where David makes preparations for the temple. He arranges resources and builders and Levites and choirs. And not only that, the author also portrays David as a Moses-like figure. God gives David plans for building the temple just as he gave plans to Moses for building the tabernacle. So why all this new material about David? The author's not trying to hide David's flaws. He knows that anybody can go read about them in the book of Samuel. Rather, he's trying to portray David as the ideal king in order to make him an image or a type of the future Messiah from the line of David. It's very similar to how Jeremiah or Ezekiel spoke of the coming Messiah as a new David. This is most clear in how the author retells the story of God's covenant promise to David in 1 Chronicles 17. When you compare this story with its parallel in 2 Samuel 7, you'll see that the author of Chronicles is highlighting that neither David, nor Solomon, nor any of the kings from his line were the Messianic king, and that when the Messiah does come, he will be a king like David. And so for this author, these stories about David from the past are what sustain his hope for the future. After David dies, we move into 2 Chronicles, which focuses on the kings that lived in Jerusalem. And again, there's lots of overlap with 1st and 2nd Kings, but there are many key differences. So the author has left out all of the stories about the kings of northern Israel so he can just focus on the line of David. And there's lots of new material about these kings from David's line. He highlights the kings that were obedient to God, and he adds new stories about how their obedience led to success and God's blessing. But he also adds new stories about kings who were unfaithful to God. They didn't follow the Torah, they led Israel to worship idols, and these kings face horrible consequences, all leading up to Israel's exile, a mess of their own making. And so this whole section becomes a series of character studies where the author wants later generations of Israelites to learn from their family history, and so become faithful to their God and the Torah. Now, the book's conclusion is really unique too. At the very end of the book, the king of the Persians, his name's Cyrus, and he tells the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, rebuild the city and the temple. And he says, last line of the book, "Whoever there is among you, of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." And that's how the book ends, with an incomplete sentence. Now, of course, the author knows about the first return from exile and the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah, but clearly in his view, the prophetic hopes of Israel were not fulfilled in those events. And so this incomplete ending shows that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile, when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. And so the book of Chronicles, it's the final book of the Jewish scriptures. It ends by pointing forward. It calls God's people to look back in order to look ahead, because the past has become the source of hope for the future. So Chronicles concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending, and that's what this book is all about.
Thank you, next. All right, so the one who authored the book of Chronicles is called the Chronicler. And you cannot find actually no in the book of Chronicles na gi-identify ang author, but traditionally he has been called the Chronicler. And he is a theologian, sharing with all the biblical writers the burden of interpreting God's ways to human beings. So he was either a priest or Levite who was employed in the service of the temple during the Persian period, that is 539 to 332 BC, and he had scribal training and access to the temple records. Okay, just like what I've said ganina, no, wala di-mention kung kinsa ang sulat sa book of Chronicles, and he is anonymous. Jewish tradition, however, speculates that Ezra could have written 1st and 2nd Chronicles, which, like Samuel and Kings, originally formed one work, but nothing within the text provides a definitive clue as to the compiler of the materials. It was also said by scholars that whoever that author was, he must be a meticulous historian, because the author relied on dependable historical documents like that of the annals, books, and records. So Chronicles was most likely written during the time of Ezra or Nehemiah. And that is the reason actually why some no nagaingon nga sila ang author ani na book. While the Jews were dispersed throughout Persia, some having returned to Israel. This was the time that Chronicles was written. The final verses of the Second Chronicles indicate that it was written after the release of the exiles from Babylon in 538 BC. Archaeological evidence supports this premise. Fragments of an actual manuscript of Chronicles can be found at Qumran, makes a date in the Persian period, which is 538 to 333 BC, almost certain. Okay, for the historical setting of these books, the Jews just returned from the exile and they were facing serious difficulties. And they found out that the restoration had not brought about the dramatic changes for which many hoped. So instead, no, they had to endure discouraging economic hardship, foreign opposition, and internal conflict. So that is what is happening in that in their time, no? And this caused the people to raise many questions like, who are the legitimate heirs, no, to the promises God gave his people? What political and religious institution should be embraced? Is there hope for a new Davidic king? So those are the questions, some of the questions of the people during that time. The purpose of these books, the First and Second Chronicles, is to review the course of history of Israel from the dawn of human race. Kaganiha, gi-mention na sa video na ito ang gilantaw na nag-start ang book of the First Chronicles sa line no, ni Adam. So, therefore, makita natin that the purpose of this book is to really review the course of history of Israel from the dawn of human race to the division of kingdoms and Babylon captivity, ending with Cyrus' edict of restoration. One of the purposes as well is to recall and emphasize the great reminders of the Lord of Israel and to explain and expound the meaning of many events on Israel's history. One purpose as well is to sustain the hopes and prayers of God's people as they wait for God to fulfill his ancient promises. To provide a comprehensive and detailed timeline of events and implicit information that was not mentioned from the previous scriptures, 1st and 2nd Kings and Samuel, and to record the preparations and buildings of the first temple of God, and of course to depict David as a great king whose lineage of Jesus Christ originated. As we saw, ganihan, Second Chronicles really give so much space, no, for the story of David. And later, as we go on with our survey, we will dig in more, no, with what the purpose of writing the First and Second Chronicles. Mel?
So thank you, Ate Klenke, for that. So now we go to the structure of the Book of Chronicles. Okay, so we start with the First Chronicles, of course, and we have here, first part is the genealogies. Okay, so we found those genealogies from chapters 1 to 9, so very long genealogy. And this genealogies help explain the two genealogies of Christ in Matthew and Luke. Second part is the United Monarchy. It's found in First Chronicle chapter 10 to Second Chronicle, wait a moment, 9. And this is where it's called United Monarchy because it's where the union of all the 12 Israelite tribes in one kingdom happened. It's also where Judah and Israel were united into one kingdom under the reign of three kings. First is Saul in chapter 10, second is David in chapters 11 to 29, and Solomon from chapters, I can't see, wait, chapters 1 to 9 of Second Chronicles. Okay. Oh no. Wala na ako na-edit ni na part. Sorry guys. But wala na ning Solomon's reign dire. Okay. So third part is the divided kingdom. I'm sorry. My bad. Okay. Third part is the divided kingdom. So after Solomon died, the kingdom, the United Kingdom, was again divided because some of the Israelite some of the Israelites or most of the Israelites did not accept King Rehoboam, which was the son of Solomon, as their king. So they rebel against Rehoboam, and that caused the division among the tribes once again. And so this divided kingdom is in chapters 10 to 28 of Second Chronicles. It's from King Rehoboam to King Ahaz. So 12 kings in total for this divided kingdom. So last part is the reunited kingdom. Okay, so after they divided, they just reunited once again. So it's found in chapters 29 to 36, from King Hezekiah to the Jews' exile and release. So it's ending na. So Hezekiah was able to unite the faithful of Israel and Judah around the Davidic throne through worship and celebration at the temple. So this too highly contributed to the unison of the Israel kingdom once again. So if you're interested, these are the kings in Chronicles. So I won't read all of their names because it will take much time, but here they are. Okay. So it's time for our break at the clan. Thank you so much for listening this far.
Wow, dali ra kaayo, short kayo na ang first part. Mag-break ta because we will prepare ourselves no sa deep kaayo nga next part sa ato ang survey. So, Mel, yay! Let us play! So, ang next na ang instructions, Mel. Okay, so all participants must open their camera and emoji will be shown on screen. Participants must imitate the emoji on screen. The best imitator will be given 50 pesos
Wow.
per.
Let's go to the unique features and special considerations of the Book of Chronicles. So for the unique features, in the traditional Jewish ordering of the Bible, Chronicles is actually the last book because it summarizes all the Jewish scriptures. Chapters 1 to 9 discusses genealogies that summarize the whole storyline of the Old Testament by naming the key characters in the stories. So it shaped the genealogies to emphasize two key lineages. First is the line of the Messianic king, which is Jesus, and the priesthood, or the line of the Levites. The author also leaves out all the negative stories of David and instead include the stories that portrayed David as a good guy or as a good king. Another unique feature is that chapter 12 has no parallel in the book of Samuel. This chapter listed 14 tribes who joined and anointed David king in Hebron rather than the usual 12. So the author uniquely emphasized that all the Israelites in the fullest and widest sense supported David. Another unique feature is David's preparation for the fulfillment of those aspects of the covenant that extended beyond his reign, and the overall theme of David preparing for a smooth transition of power is almost entirely unique to First Chronicles. Other chapters that are unique to the book of Samuel contains new materials that talk about David's preparations for the temple. I think this is the book of Chronicles contains new material that talked about David's preparations for the temple and David portrayed as a Moses-like figure. Now, for the second Chronicles, one unique feature is Rehoboam's kingdom, which was tackled in chapter 11, and it contains the evaluation of both northern and southern kingdom. And Second Chronicles focuses mainly on the events of the southern kingdom. It also contains new material about the kings in David's line, highlighting those kings that were obedient to God and introduces stories about kings that were unfaithful to God. In Second Chronicles also, we see in chapter 18 the story of Jehoshaphat and Ahab as parallel to First Kings 22. So what was unique to Chronicles was the end of verse 31, where the writer of Kings recorded Ahab's death incident to show the fulfillment of Elijah's prophecy that Ahab would die for his murder of Naboth, while the writer of Chronicles used it to show how God delivered Jehoshaphat because he followed God and cried out to him for help when he was in trouble. So there's a new perspective here regarding the regarding the death of Ahab. Okay. The book ended with an incomplete sentence. So just like what the Bible Project said a while ago. So this is like the last verse. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him and let him go up. And it concludes the Old Testament as a story in search of an ending, just like what the Bible Project said. So the context of the last verse is actually Cyrus, the king of Persia, was telling the Israelites that they can go back home, return from exile, and rebuild the city and the temple. So this incomplete ending shows the author's hope, that the author's hope is set on yet another return from exile when the Messiah will finally come to rebuild the temple and restore God's people. Okay. Now for special consideration, so we have to consider that Chronicles is a summary of Hebrew history that duplicates much of the books of Samuel and of Kings, but it focuses more on the spiritual deeds and misdeeds of the kings and on the importance of worshiping the Lord properly through the ministry of the priests and the temple. So in comparing Chronicles, Samuel, and Kings, readers will find a new discrepancies between the different accounts, particularly when it comes to the use of numbers. So often, but not always, the numbers that the chronicler reports in his telling of events are higher compared to the numbers used in Samuel and Kings. So next. So for example, in 2 Samuel chapter 8, verse 3, 4 and 1, 4, 3 to 4, and 1 Chronicle 18, 3 to 4, both report David's defeat of King Hadadezer of Zobah. However, whereas 2 Samuel states that David captured only 1,700 horsemen, 1 Chronicle asserts that David actually captured 7,000 horsemen. So biblical scholars said that there is no like precise reason behind this, discrepancies, but it is possible that some accidental scribal mistakes were made in copying the numbers used in this text. So although there are these discrepancies, the message was not affected. So they both still contain the same essence, same message, same storyline. So I think we have no problem with that. Now we go to the specific advice in reading the book of Chronicles. I mean, so first we have to know God's covenant. We have to remind ourselves of God's promise, ancient promise to his people. So in the Old Testament, Yahweh gave his first covenant to Abraham, if you remember, promising a nation, a land, and his blessings. This is highlighted in the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles, showing the genealogies, which led to the formation of Israel as a strong and abundant nation. In the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we also see Yahweh's covenant to Israel through the prophet Moses, which set them apart from the Gentiles. So the covenant involved blessings to the obedient and curses to the religious Jews. So the story of Chronicles then demonstrates this high point of blessing under David and Solomon and the low point of curses during the exile. We see here the contrast between obedience and disobedience and the results of both. So the law of Moses also promises Yahweh's restoration of Israel, which is where the book closes. Lastly, Yahweh also promised David an heir and an everlasting kingdom, which is most likely partially fulfilled in the time of Solomon, as told in the second part of the book, but its final or main fulfillment points to the future coming of the Messiah, which was indeed fulfilled in the New Testament through Christ. Second advice in reading is to know who it was written to. So it is helpful to know who these books were written to so we can better appreciate every chapter. So chapters 1 to 9 with the genealogies bring up significant names to the demographic the author was aiming for. And for us, it may have been like something not that important, but for the Israelite readers, because these are their ancestors, when they would hear these names, they will like have a picture of the story behind these names and their own testimonies. The remaining chapters about King David and the other kings mentioned are significant to them as they are eagerly waiting for the promised king. Third is to know when it was written. So knowing when the book was written will make it easier for the readers to understand what the chronicler's message is for the Israelites at that time. So this was written to the people who just got back after 70 years of exile, 400 years before Jesus. So at this time, people were waiting for God to fulfill all of his promises to them. So if you remember, God's big promises to his people were land, people, temple, and a coming king like David. And at the time the chronicler wrote this, they already have the land. They were sent back to it after their exile. The promised people or descendants of Abraham were also fulfilled, as there are thousands of them by this time. Now, they were just waiting for their building of the temple, since what they built after the exile was not the glorious temple that was prophesied, and also they are waiting for the promised king. So fourth is to know why this book was written. So the chronicler wrote the book to help the readers look back in order to look forward. It is key to understand the chronicler's why for us to appreciate the book's importance and know what we should keep our eyes out for. So the chronicler wanted to retell the Israelites their history for them to reflect as they look back on what had happened and be able to look forward to what's going to happen, giving hope to the one who is to come. So in conclusion, for our advice, okay, the Book of Chronicles is not an easy book to read. Even to start chapter, you see all of these names, you immediately go like, no, I don't like this book. But also, it may also make us feel like we've already read it before from Samuel and Kings. But just like how the chronicler wanted the Israelites to anticipate the coming of the promised king when he wrote this, we should also be as fascinated and curious as we see every event that just happened, that just happened to be retold with different lenses, directing us to the Messiah. Now we go to the key verses of Second Chronicles, the Book of Chronicles. So I need people to read these verses for me. So I will call names. Ate Lois.
Okay. First Chronicles 17, 7 to 10, it says, Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I look you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name like the names of the greatest men on earth. And I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also subdue all your enemies.
Thank you, Ate. Next, um, Josen.
Okay, so First Chronicles chapter 29, verse 10 to 13. David praised the Lord in the presence of the whole assembly, saying, Praise be to you, Lord, the God of our father Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Yours, Lord, is the greatness and the power, and the glory and the majesty and the splendor, for everything in heaven and earth is yours. Yours, Lord, is the kingdom. You are exalted as head over all. Wealth and honor come from you. You are the ruler of all things. In your hands are strength and power to exalt and give strength to all. Now, our God, we give you thanks and praise your glorious name.
Yun. Thank you. Next, si Kuya Sam. Kuya Sam. Kuya Hans.
Tulungan ko.
Yes, Kuya.
Okay. Second Chronicles 7:17 to 20. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully, as David your father did, and do all I command, and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne as a covenanted with David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor to rule over Israel. But if you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I have given you and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, which I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. I will make it by word and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord and God of their ancestors who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why he brought all this disaster on them.
Thank you, Kuya. Next, um, wait. Ate Chris. Are you there? Wala si Ate Chris. Si Kuya Jeramil.
Okay. Second Chronicle, chapter 16, verse 8 through 9. Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you railed on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord reigns throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war.
Thank you, Kuya. So thank you so much, guys, for reading with me. Next, we have the mega themes of the Book of Chronicles. So first theme is Israel's history. So by retelling Israel's history in the genealogies and the stories of the kings, the writer laid down the true spiritual foundation for the nation. So God kept his promises, and we are reminded of them in the historical record of his people, leaders, prophets, priests, and kings. So implication, this implied that Israel's past formed a reliable basis for reconstructing the nation after the exile. So because God's promises are revealed in the Bible, we can know God and trust Him to keep His word. Like Israel, we should have no higher goal in life than devoted service to God. Second theme is God's people. So by listing the names of people in Israel's past, God established Israel's true heritage. They were all one family in Adam, one nation in Abraham, one priesthood under Levi, and one kingdom under David. The national and spiritual unity of the people was important to the rebuilding of the nation. This implies that God is always faithful to his people. He protects them in every generation and provides leaders to guide them. Because God has been at work throughout the centuries, his people can trust him to work in the present, and we can rely on his and we even us can rely on his presence today. Third theme is David the king. So the story of David's life and his relationship with God show that he was God's appointed leader. David's devotion to God, the law, the temple, true worship, the people, and justice sets the standard for what God's chosen king should be like. So so Jesus Christ came to earth as a descendant of David. One day he will also rule as king over all the earth. His strength and justice will fulfill God's ideal for the king. Jesus is our hope, and we can experience God's kingdom now by giving Christ complete control of our lives, or by making him king of our lives. Fourth is true worship. So David brought the Ark of the Covenant to the tabernacle at Jerusalem to restore true worship to the people. God gave the plans for building the temple, and David organized the priests to make worship central to all Israel. So the temple stood as the throne of God on earth, the place of true worship. God's true throne now is in the hearts of his people. When we acknowledge him as the true king over our lives, true worship takes place. So last theme is the temple. The temple was the symbol of God's presence and the place set aside for worship and prayer. Built by Solomon from the plans God gave to David, the temple was the spiritual center of the Israel, or the nation. This implies that as Christians meet together to worship God, they should experience the presence of God in a way that no individual believer can. For the dwelling place of God is the people of God. So we have the body of Christ as God's temple. So we have to treasure fellowship with other believers and worshiping God together. So we go to the main theological message of the book of Chronicles. So I hope you're all still up and listening. First, we have the recognition of God is of supreme importance. So the central subject of First and Second Chronicles is the temple of God, which the writer named at least 188 times, or the temple of God is written all over the book of Chronicles. And we also see that the central passion in David's life is the building of the temple. So the building of the temple was actually a product of recognizing God as the God of Israel, the God of covenant. It was a message that even with the existence of these human kings, Yahweh is still the one that rules over Israel. So the same way goes to us. I hope that we also recognize God in our lives, because the recognition of God, or knowing that there is a God that's ruling over us, is very important. In fact, it's the most important truth in our lives, because from this truth overflows our works, our thoughts, our deeds, our actions, our decisions. Second, the full restoration of the kingdom cannot take place apart from the Davidic king and the Jerusalem temple. So Chronicles presents the people of God as organized around two central institutions, the Davidic throne and the Jerusalem temple. So we see in 1 Chronicles 17:11 to 12, the Lord said to David, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever. So obviously, this is talking about this offspring or son is Jesus, right? So the genealogies give special attention to David's lineage and to the organization of priests and Levites. David's line, we see that David's line was chosen by God as the permanent dynasty over the nation, and the establishment of David's throne demonstrates divine love and blessing for Israel. So that's these points are emphasized all throughout the book. So not only was the Davidic king or dynasty was focused in the book, but also the temple. So we see in the book that the temple was regarded as the place where God's name resides, and that the joy and splendor of music in temple is where true worship is revealed. Third theological message is the contrast between divine blessing and judgment. So the author stresses the close connection between fidelity and blessing, or obedience and blessing, and infidelity and judgment. The king and the temple cannot in themselves secure God's blessings for Israel. So there must always be obedience to the Mosaic law, to the Torah, and to prophetic and priestly instruction. The Lord also blesses those who uphold the purity of temple worship and rely on Him alone. But we also see that when the people or the kings turn to sin, an immediate retribution of illness and military defeat often follows. So we see here the contrast talaga ng when you obey God, there will be blessing. And when you disobey God and go on with your own, like follow your own will, there will be consequences. So even so, despite their disobedience, the people can still be restored. Like what grace, diba na? They still have a chance to be restored to blessing by seeking God in repentance and prayer. So these are the verses that will support this. So from this, we see that the chronicler shows that the full restoration of God's people will come only as they live in fidelity, in obedience, in reconciliation, or in communion with the Lord, to the Lord. So King Azariah says it well in 2 Chronicles 15:2. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will forsake you. Fourth point, theological message: to look forward is to look back. So coming from an exile, the Jews were starting to lose hope and faith in God. And so the book aims to take them back to the history of God's faithfulness and sovereignty. Starting the book with a genealogy from the first man, Adam, presents the author's aim to allow the Israelites to trace and see how God has been faithful in preserving the Davidic line for the promised restoration of his kingdom. So by looking back, the Jews was able to look forward to the restoration through the promised king. So the retelling of the history of Israel enabled the Jews to, restore their hope that, all throughout the current situation does not dictate or does not, affect God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Like, even though their current situation was pretty dire, they can just look back and see how God has always been faithful in like preserving all of those genealogies, all of those many names, and from that they have they draw hope bitaw. So that, if God was faithful then he's faithful now despite the situation, and he will be faithful still in the future. So now we go to Christ in Chronicles. So the hope for David's throne to be restored is fulfilled in Christ. He was born the son of David, the heir to the Davidic covenant. Cross-reference. And Christ also met all the conditions of obedience placed on David's line. In the resurrection, Christ took his throne in heaven, from which he leads his people into blessing and victory. And he will reign until all his enemies are defeated. Yeah, he will reign forevermore. The book's revelation of divine blessing and judgment is realized in Christ. So Jesus bore the judgment of God on sin to offer the divine blessing of salvation to us. So Jesus sets his people free to follow the path of obedience. And he gives his people new life and makes them citizens of God's kingdom. So, the ultimate display of the contrast between divine blessing when you obey and judgment when you sin against God is fully, the revelation was fully revealed in Christ when he died on the cross, because we received, because of Christ's obedience, we received the divine blessing of salvation. It's not our obedience, but it's Jesus' perfect obedience that was imputed to us. And in the cross, Christ, the judgment of disobedience and sin was also, or also happened through Christ. So the life of Christ reveals this divine blessing and judgment of God. So these are our references. And thank you so much, guys, for listening. Tapos na.